What drives a man to demand his own death sentence, and then, in a shocking twist, take his fate into his own hands? Scott Dozier, a convicted murderer, spent his final 24 hours in a way few could imagine. After years of challenging the system and insisting on not just his execution, but to speed it up, Dozier's story ended not in the state's hands, but his own early life. Born on November 20th, 1970, in Boulder City, Nevada, a serene desert town nestled close to the Hoover Dam, Scott Raymond Dozier appeared at first glance to have an ordinary start. His family lived in a modest, middle-class household. Life in Boulder City was quiet and steady, the kind of place where most people stayed on predictable paths. For Scott, though, those paths seemed unbearably restrictive. Even as a child, he carried an energy that hinted he wouldn't settle for ordinary. His childhood was, by most accounts, unremarkable. Teachers described him as bright, sharp, and full of potential. He had a natural charisma, often charming both adults and his peers. He wasn't at the top of his class, but his intelligence was undeniable, a quality that could have opened countless doors if channeled in the right direction. Neighbors remembered him as a confident boy, someone who seemed destined for success, though in what form wasn't immediately clear. His family, while not wealthy, provided a stable foundation, giving Scott a relatively secure upbringing. But beneath this surface of normalcy, there were cracks that hinted at a different future. Scott's teachers and family began to notice an underlying restlessness, a refusal to be confined by the rules that governed other children. He wasn't disruptive in the typical sense, but he pushed boundaries, questioning authority and testing limits wherever he could. This trait, while subtle at first, grew more pronounced as he aged. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was something deeper, a drive to carve out his own path, no matter what stood in his way. As he entered his teenage years, Scott's independence streak became more difficult to ignore. While other kids channeled their energy into sports, clubs, or academics, Scott seemed uninterested in conventional achievements. His disdain for authority and structure wasn't just a phase, it was a defining part of his character. Teachers who once praised his intelligence now struggled to manage his indifference toward schoolwork and his growing habit of bending the rules. For Scott, the system felt like a cage, and he wasn't willing to play by its rules. His search for freedom led him to seek thrills in ways that often flirted with danger. He wasn't drawn to petty mischief or simple rebellion. His actions always carried an edge of calculated risk. Friends from this time described a teenager who was fearless, almost to a fault. Whether it was taking a dare, sneaking into restricted areas, or pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable, Scott relished the adrenaline that came with bending the world to his will. He wasn't reckless in the traditional sense. There was always a purpose behind his actions, a sense that he was testing the limits to see just how far he could go. Scott's family, though supportive, began to feel the strain of his behavior. They urged him to focus on his education, to channel his energy into something productive, but their advice often fell on deaf ears. Scott had no interest in following the well-worn paths of his peers, and he made no effort to hide it. The need for independence drove Scott to leave home at an unusually young age. In his late teens, he began to drift, exploring new places and opportunities with the same restless energy that had defined his childhood. Boulder City, with its quiet streets and familiar faces, felt too small for someone like Scott. He wanted to see more, to experience life on his terms, and he wasn't afraid to take risks to get there. For a time, he moved from job to job, picking up work where he could and making just enough to support his next adventure. Those who knew him describe a young man constantly on the move, always searching for the next thrill. It was during this time that Scott's interest in risk began to intertwine with his need for control. He wasn't content simply following the rules of the working world. He wanted to make his own. This mindset led him to dabble in ventures that skirted legality, the first hints of his eventual descent into criminality. These weren't major offenses, small hustles, shortcuts that gave him a taste of the power and independence he craved, but they marked the beginning of a pattern that would define his life in the years to come. Scott's early ventures into independence and risk-taking provided a glimpse into the mindset that would later drive him to infamy. He wasn't content to live within the boundaries of society. His charm and intelligence, once seen as assets, became tools for manipulation and control. And while his early actions were small in scale, they set the stage for the choices that would define his life and ultimately his death. The crimes. Scott Dozier's entry into the world of crime came through drug trafficking, a high-stakes business that promised both wealth and danger. Methamphetamine, a drug notorious for its addictive grip and devastating impact, became the cornerstone of his operation. Unlike the impulsive, reckless dealers who often fell prey to law enforcement, Scott approached the business like a strategist. He wasn't content to be a small-time player. He wanted control over the supply chain, the distribution networks, and the people involved. His charm and intelligence, traits that had once held promise in his youth, became tools of manipulation in his new life of crime. Operating primarily in Nevada and Arizona, Dozier built a network of suppliers, couriers, and enforcers. He understood that success in the drug trade required more than just product. It required loyalty, fear, and precision. He meticulously planned every detail of his operation, from the routes his couriers used to the methods for laundering the profits. Those who worked under him described a leader who was both charismatic and ruthless, someone who inspired confidence but would not hesitate to cut ties, or worse, if he sensed betrayal. As his empire grew, so did the risks. Dozier's business wasn't just about selling drugs, it was about maintaining power in a world where violence was the ultimate currency. Rival dealers, informants, and even former allies became threats that had to be neutralized. Scott didn't see violence as a last resort. It was a tool, one he wielded with cold calculation. This willingness to cross moral and legal lines without hesitation set him apart and made him a dangerous figure in the criminal underworld. One of Dozier's most notorious acts was the murder of Jeremiah Miller, a fellow drug dealer who became entangled in his web of control and paranoia. Miller, like many in the drug trade, was looking to make a quick profit. He traveled to Las Vegas in 2002 to meet Dozier under the pretense of purchasing materials for a methamphetamine operation. What Miller didn't know was that the meeting was a setup designed not to conduct business, but to end his life. Dozier lured Miller to a room at La Concha Motel, a now defunct establishment known for its affordability and anonymity. The plan was as brutal as it was calculated. Whether out of paranoia that Miller posed a threat, or simply out of greed to eliminate a competitor and take his money, Scott saw no other option but to kill him. Miller was murdered in the motel room, his death both sudden and violent. What followed was an act of chilling pragmatism. To dispose of the body, Dozier dismembered Miller's remains, placing some of them in a suitcase that he later abandoned near an apartment complex. The suitcase, discovered by a passerby, exposed the gruesome extent of the crime. Inside were Miller's torso and other remains, wrapped in plastic and discarded as if they were merely trash. This horrifying discovery set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to Dozier's downfall. The investigation into Miller's murder was relentless. Law enforcement quickly identified Dozier as a suspect thanks to witness testimonies and forensic evidence. Associates who had once worked alongside him began to cooperate with authorities, offering details about his operations and his role in Miller's death. The evidence painted a damning picture of a man who operated with precision and without remorse, someone who viewed human lives as expendable in the pursuit of his goals. But Miller wasn't the only victim linked to Scott Dozier. Investigators also suspected him in the disappearance and murder of Jason Griffin Green, another associate from Arizona who vanished under suspicious circumstances. Like Miller, Green was involved in the drug trade, and his ties to Dozier made him a likely target. Although Dozier was never formally charged in Green's case, the parallels between the two incidents added to the narrative of a man who used murder as a means to consolidate power and eliminate threats. The trial for Miller's murder was a spectacle in its own right, drawing attention from both the media and the public. Prosecutors presented a wealth of evidence, including forensic links to the crime scene, testimonies from former associates, and the gruesome details of how Miller's body had been discarded. Dozier's calm demeanor throughout the proceedings was both unsettling and revealing. He didn't flinch at the accusations or the graphic evidence presented against him. Instead, he appeared almost detached, as if he had already come to terms with his fate. The jury had little difficulty reaching a verdict. Scott Dozier was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Yet, even in the face of this ultimate punishment, he refused to follow the script. Most death row inmates spend years, even decades, filing appeals and fighting to delay their executions. Dozier did the opposite. He waived his appeals and demanded that his sentence be carried out as soon as possible. For him, the idea of spending his life in the limbo of death row was unbearable. He saw death not as a punishment, but as an escape, a final act of control in a life defined by defiance. Execution controversy. Scott Dozier's story took an unexpected turn when he made an extraordinary request, one that shocked the public, baffled the legal system, and left a permanent mark on the debate surrounding capital punishment in America. Unlike most death row inmates who fight tooth and nail to delay their sentences, Dozier stood apart. He actively demanded his own execution. To him, the limbo of waiting on death row was worse than death itself. His request set off a ripple effect, igniting a series of controversies that pitted him against the very machinery designed to end his life. At the heart of the conflict lay not just his demand, but the means to carry it out. Nevada, unprepared to handle such an unusual case, struggled to craft a solution amidst mounting legal and ethical challenges. What followed was a drama that transcended the walls of the prison and forced the country to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and the mechanics of death. At the core of the controversy was Nevada's proposed use of an experimental lethal injection cocktail. The state intended to combine midazolam, a sedative, fentanyl, a powerful opioid, and cisatracurium, a paralytic agent. It was an untested combination, one with no guarantee of ensuring a quick or painless death. Critics immediately pointed out the risks. Midazolam had a history of botched executions, and the paralytic could mask signs of suffering, raising concerns about cruel and unusual punishment. Pharmaceutical companies quickly entered the fray. Manufacturers of the drugs slated for Dozier's execution argued that their products were never intended for such use and launched lawsuits to prevent their involvement. They feared the public backlash that could arise from their association with executions, especially one as contentious as this. These legal battles ground the process to a halt, much to Dozier's frustration. He had made his decision. He wanted to die, yet the very system tasked with carrying out that wish seemed incapable of delivering. As the legal and ethical debates raged on, the public became increasingly captivated by the case. Media outlets from across the country descended on Nevada, turning Dozier into an unlikely symbol of defiance. His calm and unapologetic demeanor during interviews only added fuel to the fire. Here was a man convicted of unspeakable crimes, yet he spoke with a rationality and resolve that unnerved even his critics. His case reignited the long-smoldering debate about the death penalty in the United States. The delays in Dozier's execution only intensified the spotlight. His execution was scheduled, postponed, rescheduled, and delayed again, each time due to ongoing legal battles over the drug protocol. For Dozier, the waiting was a punishment in itself. He publicly stated that he would rather die than endure the monotony and isolation of death row. "Life in a cage," he once said, is not life at all. His frustration grew with each passing day, and his mental state became a focal point for both supporters and critics of the death penalty. The psychological toll of waiting was undeniable. Dozier's letters and interviews painted the picture of a man caught in limbo, desperate for an end. Yet even in his desperation, there was a chilling clarity. He seemed to understand the system better than those tasked with managing it. He knew the weaknesses, the flaws, and the bureaucratic red tape that would inevitably come into play. His defiance wasn't just against the delays, it was against the system itself. As the legal battles dragged on, one question loomed large. What drove Scott Dozier to demand his own execution? Was it simply an escape from the grim realities of death row, or was it a deeper act of rebellion? A way to assert control in a system designed to strip it away. Some saw his determination as a form of protest, a way to expose the inefficiencies and hypocrisies of the justice system. Others viewed it as the final act of a man who had spent his life defying the rules. The final 24 hours. Scott Dozier's last day, January 5, 2019, was a mixture of calm acceptance and tense anticipation. It marked the end of a complicated journey for a man who had spent years declaring he preferred death over the uncertainty of death row. His final hours were as deliberate and calculated as the life he had lived. Dozier started his day in his solitary cell at Ely State Prison in Nevada. By 6 a.m., the routine of prison life began. But for Dozier, this morning was different. He had made it clear in the past that he did not fear death. His calm demeanor that day reflected this. He showed no signs of panic or regret, behaving as though he was entirely at peace with what was to come. Instead of focusing on himself, Dozier spent his final hours writing letters to loved ones. These letters were steady and clear, without desperation or fear. His words reflected his personality, methodical and composed. He didn't request a special last meal or any privileges, choosing instead to stick to the ordinary, avoiding any theatrics. While Dozier seemed calm, the atmosphere in the prison was the opposite. Guards moved with nervous energy, aware of the attention surrounding his case. Fellow inmates were abuzz with curiosity and unease. Some admired Dozier's defiance, while others questioned his motives. The guards knew that every decision they made that day would be scrutinized, and this added to the tension. By noon, preparations for Dozier's scheduled execution were underway. Every step of the process was documented meticulously, a reminder of the strict procedures that governed such events. Guards who interacted with Dozier described him as polite but distant, speaking little and showing no signs of fear. His composed behavior made even the most seasoned staff uneasy. At 1 p.m., Dozier sat quietly in his cell, reflecting on his decision. Over the years, he had stated many times that he would rather die than continue living on death row. He viewed his execution as a way out, not as a punishment. His calm demeanor that day seemed to confirm that he had made peace with his choice. However, his actions in the coming hours would show that he was still in full control of his fate. Dozier spent part of the afternoon responding to letters and reading messages from supporters. There were no emotional outbursts or dramatic goodbyes. He accepted his reality with a quiet determination that left those around him unsettled. At around 5:30 p.m., everything changed. In a stunning twist, Scott Dozier took his own life, hanging himself in his cell using a bedsheet. His decision appeared calculated, ensuring that he died on his own terms rather than waiting for the state to execute him. Guards discovered his body shortly afterward during a routine check. The news of his death spread quickly through the prison, leaving staff and inmates in shock. The discovery of Dozier's body sent the prison into chaos. Guards, accustomed to managing difficult situations, were visibly shaken. An immediate investigation was launched to determine how Dozier had managed to kill himself despite being under heightened watch. Fellow inmates gossiped among themselves, speculating on how he had pulled it off and what it meant for the rest of them. The usually strict order of prison life gave way to confusion and disarray. News of Dozier's suicide broke within hours, sparking debates across the country. His death reignited discussions about the death penalty, mental health, and the psychological toll of life on death row. Supporters of capital punishment pointed to the delays in his execution as proof of a flawed system, while opponents argued that his death highlighted the inhumanity of prolonged incarceration and the ethical challenges of a state-sanctioned death. Within the prison system, Dozier's death triggered a review of protocols. Staff were questioned about how such a high-profile inmate had managed to end his life while under close observation. Some saw his suicide as a failure of the system, while others believed it was the inevitable outcome of a man determined to control his destiny. Dozier's actions left behind many unanswered questions. Why did he choose to end his life that day? Was it a protest, a way to maintain control, or simply the result of years of frustration and despair? His decision forced the nation to confront the uncomfortable realities of the death penalty and its impact on both inmates and the justice system as a whole. For the staff at Ely State Prison, the events of January 4th, 2019 served as a stark reminder of the complexities of working within the justice system. By taking control of his own fate, Dozier ensured that his story would remain a pivotal moment in the ongoing discussion about capital punishment.